Welcome to the mini lecture on corals, chemistry and climate. I'm Jens, I'm a professor in paleobiology at the University of Leicester. And what you see here on this picture is me and a former student drilling a coral in Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And the picture nicely illustrates why I love my work. I get to travel to warm tropical countries. I can dive in the warm ocean and study the underwater world, and at the same time I can meet a lot of people from very different cultural backgrounds. And you might wonder why a geologist studies corals and not a biologist. Because corals are animals. Well, entire mountain ranges are built from coral reefs. For instance, the Alps in southern Europe are home to many ancient coral reefs. What you see here is a picture of a 200 million year old reef in northern Italy that formed a 300-meter high cliff. When you think about corals, you may think about colorful creatures, lots of colorful fish. And that's absolutely correct. Corals come in many sizes and shapes, and to provide home and shelter for many different animals. And that protects them from the big predators that would otherwise eat them. Corals really love warm water, lots of sunlight and very clear water. So you will find them across the globe in water temperatures between 18 and 33 degrees Celsius. They occur down to a water depth of about 40 meters. On the map here, you see a lot of red dots and red shaded areas. This is where coral reefs occur today. This is where they are living and forming large structures. The largest is in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, more than 2,000 kilometers long. Coral reefs are really valuable to humans, and that is also the reason why we study them. They provide coastal protection from giant waves. They are important for human health. You can find a lot of medicine in the oceans, much more than on land. 25% of all marine life live around coral reefs, despite coral reefs forming only 1% of area on our Earth's surface. Coral reefs also protect us from floods, and they are really valuable for tourism. Lots of us enjoy going to a tropical country and swim in the warm waters, but lots of people's life depend on coral reefs. And coral reefs are really important for food production. Well-managed coral reefs can provide food for 1.2 billion people on our planet. Well, it takes a long time for a coral to build a hard skeleton and eventually a coral reef. When a coral reproduces, it forms a larvae. The larvae attaches to the sea floor and grows into a young coral that is shown here on the left. In the middle you see a young coral that builds a hard cup-shaped skeleton under itself. As the coral grows, it continues to add material to its skeleton. On the right hand side you see many of young coral polyps forming an entire coral animal. Their skeleton slowly builds up into a reef, and forming a large reef can take 10,000 years. And eventually you end up with a mountain like we saw in northern Italy. The ability of corals to form a hard skeleton of limestone depends on a little helper, tiny little algae that live inside them. And these algae are plants, so they do photosynthesis. The photosynthesis needs sunlight, so that explains why corals only occur in shallow warm water with lots of sunlight. The photosynthesis from the algae provides the coral animal with sugars and carbohydrates, so actually food. And the coral animal in return gives all the waste products back to the algae, for instance carbon dioxide and nutrients. So it's a perfect symbiosis developed over millions of years. This symbiosis makes them really sensitive to climate change, especially ocean warming. And this is what happened in the last few years. Healthy corals, what you see on the left, turn totally white, what you see here in the middle. This phenomenon is called coral bleaching. It happens when sea surface temperature or ocean temperature is more than 1 degree warmer than it normally would be. Corals don't like too hot water, so they will expel the algae. The algae no longer produce the food, so the corals starve and die. And all that is left, sadly, is a dead coral reef. And this process of coral bleaching has led to the loss of 40% of all coral reefs on our planet in the last 30 years. And the main cause is ocean warming due to climate change. And that is nicely illustrated in the graph to the right. Climate scientists produce graph of temperature change through time. So you see that the graph is climbing up towards the right. And the red bars show the coral bleaching events that have occurred in the last 2 to 3 decades. And during these big events, all corals worldwide were affected. So this is very worrying. What does it mean for corals and their survival in the 21st century? Will you be able to see coral reefs when you grow up? Well, one way to find out if corals might survive is to study the temperatures that they experienced during their lifetime in the past. But how do we know how temperatures changed? Well, on the left-hand side you see a graph of ocean temperature change. And this is derived from thermometers that people put on ships. So as soon as humans started traveling across the oceans with commercial ships, they measured ocean temperature since the 19th century. And from that we know that the oceans have warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the mid of the 19th century. And the oceans are measured along ship tracks. And they are illustrated nicely here on the right hand side. You see these yellow lines. In the 1800s, very few yellow dots crossed the ocean, so it means very few ships. Very few ships means very few observations. So we don't actually know how the temperature changed in many parts of our ocean. If we come to the present day, we see lots of ships, lots of traffic across our oceans. And we have also satellites in the orbit now that also monitor our oceans. But we can turn to corals instead to give us a record of what happened to them in the past and compare them to the ship observations. We use massive corals here in Leicester for this type of research. It is shown here on the left hand side, a typical image of a big massive coral. We drill a core and then we go to the hospital and we take an X-ray of the core. And the X-ray produces the architecture of the coral. So we see light and dark bands. Every light and dark band forms 1 year. So we can count these yearly growth rings just like in trees and determine the age of the coral. And sometimes on these images you see discrete white lines. These are the scars left over from past coral bleaching events. So you can actually use the skeleton as a record of what happened to them in the past. That will help us to understand if the current coral bleaching events are new or if they occurred also in the past. And we can also take advantage of the fact that the corals incorporate a lot of chemicals into their skeleton from reef water during their growth. Corals grow continuously, have a very long lifespan of up to 650 years, and the yearly growth bending can be studied for its chemical variations. And this chemistry actually tells us the chemistry of the oceans. So these records allow us to study climate and the environment that the corals lived in. We can use living corals that are living today, and we can use fossil corals that are dead for many thousands of years but use the same methodologies. Here's an example. On the left you see a picture of an X-ray with a white dotted line. The white dotted line is actually produced by drilling small samples, powder, from the limestone of the coral. That is done with a dentist drill. So remember, next time you go to the dentist, it's the same equipment we use for corals to study their chemistry. Then we use some very highly sophisticated machines, and they tell us the chemical variations in the coral. That is illustrated here by the blue lines. It's quite a wiggly line, going up and down. If you put that wiggly line over a temperature reading, that's the red line, then you see that they mirror each other. That tells us that the chemical record in the coral responds to changes in water temperature. So we can use that to reconstruct the temperature during their long lifetime. But corals can do much more. They also tell us how much rain fell over the ocean, how much pollution we had, and even about nuclear disasters. At the end of my presentation, I like to show you a video. And this video illustrates the process of coral drilling, how we extract our core for our research. So we go diving, sometimes in very shallow waters like here, probably just half a meter under the water. This is the 5-meter large coral from Madagascar. You can see it's a very big structure. It looks actually like a rock. Only the upper 5 millimeter on the surface is living tissue. Underneath is the dead skeleton built up during its long lifetime. The process of drilling is actually quite nice. You can observe all the fishes that swim around the coral and that are attracted by our drilling process. I hope you enjoyed this little excursion into our tropical oceans. And if you have more questions, you can ask me and Teddy, who is following after this talk, giving her experiences about research on coral reefs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi everyone, my name is Hedy Kravczyk and I am working with Dr. Jens Zinke on the reconstructions of our planet's past climate from coral cores. I hope you have watched his talk on why coral reefs are so important and how these reconstructions work. Now I want to give you a little bit of insight on my perspectives of being a girl in the geosciences and why I love the work that I'm doing. First of all, I have always loved exploring our planet's wonders and wanted to understand how it all works. What I love a lot about my research is that it gives me plenty of opportunity to travel. This map just shows a couple of the locations I was able to visit during my studies, giving me the chance to explore coral reefs in Southeast Asia and Australia and become friends with the local wildlife. But I also want to emphasize that even if you don't like to travel and do field work, or just are not able to, you can still become a geoscientist. There is plenty of opportunity to do lab and computer-based research if this is your jam. But as I really enjoy working in the field, here are some reasons why. First of all, you get the chance to learn totally new skills. For example, how to release a research boat on a pebbly beach and how to use heavy machinery, sometimes even underwater. Here are some pictures of me drilling into a coral in Western Australia and then cutting these cores for further investigation. It is also important to learn how to document every work step right away so that you have all the information you need once you are back home and start working with your samples. Another reason why I love field work is that it is always a big team effort. You get to meet new people and have to work with them in various environments. And this work is only done efficiently if everybody is working together. For example, when you work underwater, you can only work as long as you still have oxygen to breathe. So time is very limited. This means that you can't get these precious coral cores without one person operating that drill and another one transporting oxygen tanks from and to the boat, while a third person is hooking those tanks on and off the drill. Being in the field also gives plenty of opportunity to share experiences and ideas with your colleagues. You get to sit together and talk about initial results of problems and pick everybody's brains for solutions. So, as you can see, working in the field as a geoscientist is mostly not a one-person job, but a massive team effort, which just makes it so much more fun. Once your fieldwork is done, the next step in your research is working on the samples that you've brought back home. And this sometimes feels a little bit like detective's work. Again, you get to learn some new skills and techniques. For example, how to operate an X-ray machine and how to interpret these images. Like trying to figure out what this banding in the coral is actually telling you about its growth history. In my field, a big part of the research is built upon chemistry. So I get to work in labs a lot, analyzing samples from my coral cores and operating fancy machines like this mass spectrometer, which is giving me information about the sample's chemical composition. So after you have worked up all your samples and analyzed them, you then have to take all that data and make sense out of it. For that, you learn a lot of new skills again. For example, some new software on your computer, or even how to write your own computer code to make certain calculations with your data. So basically what you're doing is to listen to the story the coral is telling you, translating this information into words, and then writing down the story to inform people. This here, for example, is the story of the coral we have drilled in Borneo. It gave us some information about how climate variability works in the region and what impacts it has. Once you have figured out this story, you don't want to keep it to yourself. Which brings me to the next thing that I love about working in research: sharing that new knowledge with others. This can be at scientific conferences and workshops with other scientists from all over the world, but it is also a lot of fun to put your science in a little less complicated words and share it with a broader audience. For example, in blogs or at public engagement and science communication events, just like this one. I personally think it is our duty as scientists to make the knowledge we gain from our work as accessible as possible. One example to do so is to join student societies that embrace this goal. I am a member of the International Coral Reef Society's student chapter, and currently one of our aims is to translate all of our content into various languages, because not everybody understands English. But that shouldn't keep people from reading exciting stories about the reef sciences. And last but not least, what I love about my research is that you constantly have to broaden your horizons and expand your network, which leads to collaborations and research visits all over the world. You get to know new people and institutions and get to learn about their work. And sometimes this leads to discovering a common research topic and a new team to work on a project together. In my personal experience, for example, this gave me the chance to work with the Sarawak Forestry Department in the reefs of Borneo, but also learn about their reforestation and hornbill protection programs. And while visiting a colleague at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, I did not only have the opportunity to explore their coral core archives, but also got a private tour of the so-called CSIM, one of the most impressive marine research facilities I've ever seen. Here, the scientists grow corals in aquariums and experiment on how different environmental conditions influence these corals. All of this can be controlled by a computer, from salt and nutrient content in the water to temperature, light, and much more. This work can give us some answers to what we have to expect under increasing pressures due to human-made climate change. On my final slide, after showing you some of the many aspects why I really love the field I'm working in, I also want to briefly show you some examples of how and what for we apply the coral archives. The first example is from the Australian west coast. Here we are looking at reefs in the so-called Exmouth Gulf. These reefs are very turbid, which means they are quite murky due to a lot of sediment in the water. We are investigating this area to gain a better understanding of the pressures on these reef systems. From coral cores that we've drilled in November 2017, we were able to reconstruct a storm or wind event which transported big amounts of material from these plains here, as you can see in this satellite picture, onto the reefs. So you can see this red stuff that is in the water. This satellite picture is actually from January 2017 when the event happened, and we drilled the cores in November 2017 in these locations indicated by those dots. And what we found is this material actually captured in the uppermost layers of the skeleton of the corals. The second example is from Borneo. Here we use the coral cores to understand the climatic dynamics in the region and how they have changed since the massive population rise in Southeast Asia. In Borneo, deforestation caused by logging and palm oil companies has changed the natural environment massively. The investigation of our coral cores provides us with a better understanding of how these changes have actually influenced the coral reefs. So as you can imagine, if you kind of cut down all the trees in the land here, or a lot of the rainforest here, the soil is kind of prone to erosion, which means that if you have like a lot of rainfall, the soil gets transported away into the rivers and then by the river systems into the coastal area and ultimately also in the reefs, which are indicated here. So investigating our coral cores helps us to understand how this has changed over time. And last but not least, I am currently working on coral cores from the Northwest Australian shelf. These reefs are super interesting because they are not under direct pressure through human activity, like for example massive fishing, tourism or sewage disposal, because they are just so far out from the coast. But these reefs are in a very important area for our climate, the so-called Indo-Pacific warm pool. This region is very warm all year long, and thus the water evaporates, rises and forms clouds constantly and in big amounts. You could say it's kind of like the heat and steam engine for our atmospheric circulation. Further, these reefs are in the only tropical gateway between the Pacific Ocean, which is on this side here, and the Indian Ocean. And our reef side is located here. This gateway leads to massive mixing of less salty waters from the warm pool because, as you can imagine, if you have all those clouds, there's also a lot of rain, which kind of dilutes these waters in the warm pool, into the Indian Ocean. And this kind of mixing is a big driver for our ocean circulation. We are using the coral cores to gain a better understanding of these dynamics of water temperature and salinity, and ultimately our planet's natural climate variability and how human-made climate change has influenced it. The cores I am working on cover the past round about 250 years, so way before measurement data from ships was available. And I am very excited to see which story from the past times the corals have to tell here. But this is still to be announced since I'm currently working on this in my PhD project. And with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention and hope to see you during the online live event in December.